Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Naomi, a historian here at the Edison Ford Winter Estates. One of Seven Sisters, The History of Women's Higher Education, explores the history of women's access to and achievements in higher education during the late 19th to early 20th century. The photograph on the title page here, this was taken in 1886, and it depicts the first class of Bryn Mawr College, which will be discussed further in the presentation. In an era when women's education was often relegated to homemaking, there were women who aspired to higher education. And these women, they would be the pioneers of female college graduates and professionals. And I always like to have guiding questions for my presentations here. So how did women navigate restrictions to higher education in the late 19th to early 20th century? How did Bryn Mawr and the other Seven Sisters colleges improve the conditions of their alumni? What barriers do these women still face? And how did the achievements of the Seven Sisters influence modern-day higher education? And I also like to have disclaimers in my presentations. So we'll see some language that reflects the gender, racial, and class discrimination that was directed toward women in the Victorian era. Viewing this language through a critical lens will help us better understand how this viewpoint affected the progression of women's role in higher education and gender equality and education as a whole. And I also like to have theories with my presentations, help us get a better understanding of everything. So we have feminine psychology that was developed in the 1920s and 30s by German psychoanalyst Karen Horney. And this is her here. It was a counter to the sexism in Sigmund Freud's theories. So Horney, she challenged Freud's underlying assumption that women are basically dissatisfied with their sex. She took the view that Freud's theories and their popularity were born of phallocentric attitudes and suppositions, not the biological science Freud asserted was his source. So here's her book, Feminine Psychology. And in Horney's 1934, The Overevaluation of Love, she asserts that cultural prescriptions for women cause overdependence and a need for male approval, as well as internal feelings of worthlessness. So she's really saying that women aren't inherently inferior to men. That's something brought up culturally, socially, and we'll see a lot of this, especially in the Victorian era, which you'll notice she was born in 1885. And Dr. Horney, she was a very accomplished psychoanalyst. She graduated from the University of Berlin with an MD in 1911, 11 years after higher education became available to women in Germany. She became a founding member of the Berlin Psychoanalytical Institute in 1920 as well. And women's victories in higher education during the Victorian era, that granted women like Dr. Horney the opportunity to become academics. And this is her here with her dog. And I think her quote here is very thematic to what we're going to be talking about in the presentation. To find a mountain path all by oneself gives a greater feeling of strength than to take a path that is shown. So we have here what's called the women's sphere. So for some historical context, the Victorian era, 1837 and 1901, so that was the reign of Queen Victoria in England. That was characterized by rapid industrialization and strict social hierarchies. So society clung to the values of Victorian culture that espoused weakness as strength as a platitude toward women. Gender expectations were increasingly polarized, just as class expectations were seemingly harmonized. Women were expected to cultivate the domestic sphere and not interfere with the male world of business, higher education, and politics. And a lot of this control was through etiquette. So we see here mainstream American etiquette accomplishes socially what American society wishes to accomplish politically, so that established authority can exercise its power with a minimum of resistance and or risk. So we have here Emily Post and her 1922 etiquette book. Etiquette was often weaponized to control women and maintain status quo. And these expectations, they mainly affected middle and upper class women, as working class women were not viewed as upholding the standard of true womanhood. And we have a quote here from Emily Post's etiquette book, How to Cultivate an Agreeable Speech. The first requirement for charm of speech is a pleasing voice. A few singing lessons, even though you have no gift for music and will never sing a note, are of inestimable value in teaching you to place your speaking voice and in teaching you to breathe. So notice the language that Post uses to address her audience. Women are urged to partake in speech that is agreeable, meaning that they should be pleasant to listen to. We can also observe that Post wrote her book in 1922, demonstrating that even after the Victorian era, there were those who still wanted to uphold Victorian values. Women were also expected to be the moral compass of the home and to encourage the men in their lives to be virtuous. Religion or piety was the core of women's virtue, the source of her strength. Women were warned not to let their literary or intellectual pursuits take them away from God. And there was not the same emphasis of religion being placed on men. Instead, it was almost expected for them to lose their morality in pursuit of capital, but it was women's collective duty to bring them back home. So the home was regarded as a true woman's priority. Women who violated the societal rule faced harsh criticism. So we have a quote here: Mary Wollstonecraft, Frances Wright, and Harriet Martineau were condemned in the strongest possible language. They were read out of the sex. They are only semi-women, mental hermaphrodites. So because these women dared to pursue philosophy and social reform in their writings, they often had critiques toward the societies they were born into. They were regarded as not belonging entirely to their sex. And a fun fact here, Mary Wollstonecraft, she's actually the mother of the Frankenstein author Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. In religious institutions, they would encourage women's education under the guise of instilling Christian values into their children. So the ideal of the Christian wife, mother, and teacher gave repeated urgency to women's education. Educating women to be teachers became a respected element in the good works and goals of all religious groups. So a lot of the early women's colleges, they would primarily be seminary institutions like Mount Holyoke. And the reason that I have colleges in quotation marks here, it's not exactly the same academic rigor as what you would see in colleges today. They haven't gotten to that point yet, early on in this early stage. And the main priority in educating women was their utility to men. So women shared family goals, and their household contributions were essential in promoting the well-being of families and communities. So you have The Sphere of a Woman and Godey's Lady's Book. So the focus, the woman being in the home, tending to the children, maintaining that there. And while Christian colleges were motivated to educate women for the sake of maintaining the status quo, some of them were very progressive for the era. Oberlin College in Ohio was among one of the first colleges to admit women alongside men. Founded in 1833, Oberlin would also be one of the first colleges to admit Black students. So to its militant Christian founders, Oberlin College in Ohio was God's college. Here, men and women, white and Black, were to be educated together to carry out God's cause on earth. So you can see a class photo here, 1855. But even with these progressive values, Oberlin still engaged in practices that would very much reflect the era it was founded in. In most institutions, coeducation did not mean that all classes were joint. As at Oberlin, they were often separate. Moreover, women usually did not take the full liberal arts course, but were assigned instead to a separate female department. And female students were initially rewarded with diplomas from the ladies' course and were not admitted into the baccalaureate program until 1837. So originally, women did not get bachelor's degrees. And colleges, especially religious institutions, they were very contradictory in how they implemented their education of women. We'll see a lot of that throughout the colleges in this era. A number of schools appeared before 1800, but the largest expansion by far came between 1830 and 1850. So academic expansion paralleled the large growth in men's colleges. However, some form of collegiate education was established for men, academy instruction for women was likely to appear. And I really like this cartoon here, Woman's Sphere. You can see she's peering outside of it, so women are starting to leave their proper place, you can say. And why was there such an increase of women in higher education? The religiously motivated, they saw education as an avenue to elevate their communities. So educated Christian mothers, so parents, especially the mothers that made educated Christian children. And education also had the potential to elevate social status and provide individuals with more occupational opportunities. President Abraham Lincoln, he would sign off on policies like the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862, and that set aside 30,000 acres for each state and provided funding for colleges. So they found some land out in the West. So we're getting more access to public education. More people have the opportunity to receive an education. And the women's movement in the late 19th century, that would also provide a steady stream of support for female education. So the Sororities, the New England Women's Club, the Association for the Advancement of Women, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, among others, all actively supported female education. Boffin's Bower would be founded in 1870. So that's the artwork behind all my slides here. This is a clearer picture of it. It was named after a home in Charles Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, and it was a charity that was started by Jenny Collins, a labor and women's rights activist. Boffin's Bower provided working class women with aid, a place to read and socialize, and a place for them to advocate for labor and women's rights. So an interesting aspect about Boffin's Bower was that it was founded by a working class woman here. As most of the focus in history of women's education, they're looking at the upper and middle class women. They're not really looking at the working class women who still made efforts to educate themselves despite the class barriers. But that was important to point out that these women were educating themselves as well. And between the 1850s and 1870s, several models developed of these schools. You have the private women's college, the religiously oriented coeducational college, the private coordinate women's college, the secular coeducational institution, both public and private, and the public single-sex vocational institution. So you're getting several models of schools here. And the Seven Sisters, that was a reference to the Greek myth of Pleiades, sister nymphs that were transformed into a constellation of the same name. These colleges were intended to be the female equivalent of the Ivy League colleges, which only accepted male students at the time. You have a map here, so the world of Ivy. You can see the Ivy League colleges, and the Seven Sisters are also here as well. And they were the following. You have Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. You have Vassar College in New York. Wellesley College, also in Massachusetts. Smith College, Massachusetts. You have Radcliffe College, also in Massachusetts. Bryn College in Pennsylvania, and Barnard College in New York. So you'll notice all of these schools here in the Northeast, most of them being in Massachusetts and New York. So you have a painting here of the Seven Sisters and their astrological counterpart here. And between 1870 and 1900, the number of females enrolled in institutions of higher learning multiplied almost eightfold, from 11 to 85,000. This increase was more rapid than that for males, and the number of women as a percentage of all students rose from 21% to at least 35% in this time. So you're really seeing an increase. You can also see in this table here, colleges open to men and women. You can see as we go throughout the years, we start to have more institutions. We also see here college women as a percentage of young women in the United States. That percentage rises as well. And the new fear was that women would take over the colleges. The impact on male enrollments was the central issue. Academic achievement was held against females when they surpassed males in either sheer numbers or academic honors. So this is becoming a real concern in the colleges. We have climbing the ivory tower. So new arguments emerge from scientific thinking to endanger female higher education. Darwinian evolution relegated women to a permanently inferior condition physically and mentally. So for example, you have Dr. Edward Clark's Sex and Education. And it argued that there would be damage to women's uteri if they underwent the mental and physical rigor that higher education required. So his viewpoint was not uncommon, and some universities even enacted policy changes due to concerns that female students would excel over male students. You have a cartoon here, the goddess Minerva, and it says ladies not admitted. And female students, they were trapped in a dichotomy. If their performance was insufficient, they proved the inferiority of their sex. However, if they excelled, they were perceived as a threat to the male students and faculty. Their only real option was to return to the respectable sphere of women, which many female students would ultimately do. Graduating seniors in the first two generations did not question the belief that they should contain their ambitions within the boundaries of domesticity. And gender discrimination, that was not the only battle that female students would have to overcome. Nothing was more crucial among the factors accelerating women's advance into academic institutions than family support. Ascent depended on available financial resources and recognition of the value of a college education for the particular daughter. So if a female student's family could not afford college, she would either have to work to pay off the expenses or give up on her dreams of pursuing academia. Opportunities for financial aid were extremely limited during this era, especially for female students. In women's colleges like the Seven Sisters, they often perpetuated the elitism of the era. Students who had a socioeconomic background not from wealth, so a lot of working class students, they were less likely to attend. And then we have the co-ed institutions. So the co-ed students, the female students, they often remained a second-class citizen, for male attitudes depended on the mores of the particular institution. Female students during this era, they faced constant judgment from their families, the media, and even the college institutions themselves. So they're under a lot of scrutiny no matter what decision they make. They underwent immense pressure and would often confide in each other, developing strong bonds and forming women's clubs, committees, and other forms of organization. And women who attended college during the Victorian era, they had to make a pivotal decision: continue the unconventional route or return to normalcy. And normalcy meant marriage, having children, but marriage that interfered with academic and occupational pursuits. Whatever their concepts of marriage and self, all women experienced the threat of frequent pregnancy resulting from the religious decree that a wife must always submit to her husband's will. The problems caused by lack of access to birth control were universal. So if a woman wanted to continue an academic career, a lot of the times they had to postpone marriage or just not get married at all. Colleges were also not interested in granting opportunities to married women. They viewed it as a waste of resources. It was not uncommon for female academics to remain unmarried for these reasons, especially when they wanted to attend graduate school and develop a professional career. And we don't see a fellowship for a married woman until 1929. So it's a while until married women can really receive academic support. And of the 229 women who received the doctorate in the 19th century, only 16 were married at the time the degree was conferred. But not all women were allowed to make this choice. For those who had their families funding their education, it was often considered an obligation to marry and have children. The family claim, as Jane Addams described it, referred to the tradition that an unmarried adult daughter's first obligation was to her parents. So a woman's life during this era was often not her own. She was a useful tool to advance her family's status in the world. College was viewed by upper-class families as part of a strategy to elevate their daughters and find them suitable spouses. The Seven Sister Colleges were no exception to this. In Bryn Mawr College, this school would be founded in 1885 by Orthodox Quaker Dr. Joseph Taylor as the counterpart to Haverford College. So we have Bryn Mawr here. Dr. Taylor, he emphasized that Bryn Mawr students should become mothers and would train infant minds and give direction to character and make the home the center of interest and attraction. So they're still focused on women serving the men in their lives, their communities. The dean and second president of Bryn Mawr, M. Carey Thomas, she would change the emphasis of Bryn Mawr from motherhood to academic rigor. She wanted Bryn Mawr to be the equivalent to the best of the men's colleges. As during this era, the women's coordinate colleges, they were counterparts to the male colleges the same way that women were expected to be the counterparts of men during this era. So not necessarily equals, more of the companion helpmate role. And this is M. Carey Thomas here. Between 1870 and 1920, women received little active, direct institutional encouragement to embark on graduate study. Only Bryn Mawr, at the insistence of then Dean M. Carey Thomas, included a PhD from the beginning in 1885. So at the time, this was the only women's college where you could receive a PhD in the United States. The undergraduate and graduate courses offered in the years 1905 through 06 and 1906 through 07 were the following here. So you had language courses, you had ancient languages like Sanskrit and Latin. You had languages like French and Spanish as well, so they also had modern languages. You have history, economics and politics, law, philosophy, education, history of art and classical archaeology, mathematics, and we have the sciences. So you have physics, chemistry, geology, and biology. So a lot of academic rigor for these students here. And they also enjoy things like theater as well. Thomas Edison's daughter, Madeline, this is her center stage. And we'll get into her time at Bryn Mawr in a bit. And we have their college program here. And they give credit to Johns Hopkins University for what they called the group system. So sort of like the college majors, grouping them together there. And from the Civil War to World War I, female college students, they identified themselves as three generations based on their experiences. The first generation, so that's the 1860s to 1880s, they were the pioneers. They still identified with true womanhood. So we have M. Carey Thomas with her friends here. They call themselves the committee. This is her here. So they were part of that first generation of students. You have the second generation, the 1890s and 1900s. They expanded upon their predecessors' achievements, and they were called New Women. Then you have the third generation, so that's the 1910s to the 1920, continuation of the New Woman, and they started to really develop progressive values. First generation college women, they were forthrightly serious, single-minded, and conscientious. They hid neither purposefulness nor anxiety. In contrast, the women of the second and third generations let themselves appear to be at college for the pursuit of happiness. And we will see examples in this presentation of how women in these three generations navigated their college experiences, what they did after graduating. So for example, with the first generation, you have Martha Carey Thomas, better known as M. Carey Thomas. She belongs to that first generation. And this is her here. She was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1857, and she was the eldest of 10 siblings. She was raised in a family of Quakers. And as a Protestant Christian denomination, Quakers during this era possessed a contradictory viewpoint of women. They believed in the equality of the sexes, but still enforced Victorian gender roles. And this contradiction would contribute to M. Carey Thomas's feminist ideals later in life. She attended Cornell University in 1875, where she would receive her bachelor's degree. She would also attend Johns Hopkins University in 1877 with hopes to attain a second degree, but she was unable to due to restrictions placed upon female students. In 1879, she would convince her father to allow her to travel to Germany to study, and she would ultimately transfer to the University of Zurich in Switzerland. Interestingly, in the 1880s and 1890s, some aspirants, undaunted, applied to European centers of learning. American women pushed their way first into the Swiss University of Zurich, and with considerably more difficulty, enrolled at some German institutions. So when given the opportunity, women around the world would travel to countries that they deemed suitable for their education. This would include American women studying in countries like Germany and Switzerland, and even Japanese women coming to America. When they encountered barriers, there were some women willing to develop their own strategies to circumvent them. And M. Carey Thomas, she would be one of these women. As in 1882, she would become the first woman and foreigner to obtain a doctorate summa cum laude. Continuing her career in academia, she would request in 1883 the board of directors of Bryn Mawr to grant her the position of president. So she heard there was a women's college in development. She wanted to be the president of that school. She would instead be offered the position of dean. She did accept the position, becoming the first dean of a women's college to hold a doctorate. And she would become president in 1894. And we have a quote from her here, 1908, to the North American Women's Suffrage Association in Buffalo. She says, "The man's world must become a man's and a woman's world. Why are we afraid?" Like many of her first generation college peers, M. Carey was an ambitious and well-accomplished woman, devoting her life to academia and furthering educational opportunities for women, with the exception of Black and Jewish women. Most educators believe that they must preserve the so-called Anglo-Saxon superiority of their colleges and use the popular scientific theory of inherent racial differences to justify their intent. Jewish applicants became the most conspicuous targets. And this should be referred to as the Jewish problem. Unfortunately, M. Carey Thomas, she would be a vocal advocate for anti-Semitism. So you can see here, even into the 30s, you look at the percentage of Jewish students at the colleges here. And in 1937 to 38, Bryn Mawr reports that it has no Jewish problem. Of this year's freshman class, 6% are Jewish. In 1886, Sadie Zold, she would be the first Jewish student admitted into Bryn Mawr, much to Thomas's chagrin. The secretary of the school described Zold as a quiet, ladylike girl, promising to make a good student. Despite this, Thomas fiercely registered her strongest protest at her admission and argued that Zold should be the last Jewish student admitted. And we have some quotes here from Thomas's speech. She says, "If the present intellectual supremacy of the white races is maintained, as I hope that it will be for centuries to come, I believe that it will be because they are the only races that have seriously begun to educate their women. If the laws of heredity mean anything whatsoever, we are jeopardizing the intellectual heritage of the American people by this headlong intermixture of races." In the last section of her address here, "Our first immigration was made up of the dominant races of the world, the English, Scotch, French, Dutch, German, and the singularly gifted, even if politically unsuccessful, Irish and Welsh. Our present immigration is precisely the reverse." So this was a 1916 address she gave at the opening of Bryn Mawr. So we can see, unfortunately, she has very strong white supremacist viewpoints. And in 1901, a Black student named Jessie Redmond Fawcett, she had just graduated from the Philadelphia High School for Girls. This was back then a feeder school into Bryn Mawr, and she had a full 4-year scholarship to Bryn Mawr College. Thomas would proceed to have Fawcett transferred to Cornell. To cover Fawcett's tuition, Thomas pledged 10% of her personal funds and solicited money from friends, relatives, and other college presidents. Fawcett would later become part of the influential art movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. So she was still able to become successful. What I think is interesting, Bryn Mawr's online newspaper, Bryn Mawr Bulletin, they would even publish a summer 2020 article titled Bryn Mawr's Loss, covering how Bryn Mawr missed out on Fawcett's talent due to racism. And even after her tenure of presidency, So M. Carey Thomas, her presidency ends 1922. She would still wield her influence in attempts to bar certain students from attending Bryn Mawr. As a board member, she would advocate against the admission of Enid Cook in 1927. So she writes a letter to the president of Bryn Mawr, and she says, as far as I know, none of our former or present students have been accustomed in their daily lives to use the same bedrooms, sitting rooms, bathrooms, to eat at the same tables, or to associate socially with Negro men and women. For it is not a question of Negro women only. If Negro students are admitted to Bryn Mawr, their Negro men friends would have to be permitted to call and be entertained in the college drawing rooms, and to be included in outside audiences of lectures, concerts, etc., and in the students' plays and other entertainments. As a condition of Cook's acceptance, she had to stay in off-campus housing, which was very uncommon during this era. Usually you would stay at home with your family if you lived close enough to the school or you were bored at the school. And despite all this blatant discrimination she was facing, Cook would go on to become the first Black woman to graduate from Bryn Mawr in 1931. She is credited as the first person to isolate the yellow fever virus in Panama, and she would share credit with her husband, Arcadio Rodinich, in identifying the viral strain that caused a polio outbreak in Panama from 1950 to 1951. So she would later on in life move to Panama. And you can see with all of these women, so with Zold, Fawcett, and Cook, they're all very accomplished. Even so, unfortunately, Thomas very discriminatory toward them because of their ethnicity and race. And then we have a quote here from the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. He mentions that the seven sister colleges, they had a very small number of Black students. He says Vassar had graduated but one Negro student and did not know it at the time. So this is her here. Anita Florence Hemmings, she attended Vassar College in 1893, and she graduated in 1897. She had to pass as white to attend the institution. And he says, Bryn Mawr and Barnard have tried desperately to exclude them. Radcliffe, Wellesley, and Smith have treated them with tolerance and even cordiality. And from the outset, most Black institutions were coeducational, for their communities could not afford the luxury of single-sex schools. So we can see here that Black communities were not able to initially partake in developing elite private schools for their daughters due to funding issues. Still, whenever able, Black families would support their children's ambitions to attend college. Himself a college-educated man, Du Bois would send his daughter Yolande to Fisk University, one of the first HBCUs, in 1920. So we can see here that your education during this era was often affected by your class, race, and gender. In 2017, as a response to an increase of racialized violence in the United States, Bryn Mawr would address its legacy. So President Cassidy would say, while Thomas had a profound impact on opportunities for women in higher education, on the academic development and identity of Bryn Mawr, and on the physical plan of the campus, she also openly and vigorously advanced racism and anti-Semitism as part of her vision of the college. And this is Bryn Mawr's motto here. I think it's interesting. It says, I delight in the truth. In 2018, the buildings formerly known as Thomas Library and Thomas Hall, they were renamed Old Library and Great Hall. So Bryn Mawr here is an example of how even an institution that was progressive for its time could still be steeped in prejudice, and how acknowledging that history can allow for more progress to be made. We can acknowledge that M. Carey Thomas spearheaded initiatives to put Bryn Mawr on equal footing with men's colleges, but we must also accept that she abused her power to attempt to end the academic career of students due to her own biases. We have already acknowledged young women that had to fight against the odds to receive their college education, but what about the opposite? What did the typical upper-class student look like at Bryn Mawr and the other seven sister colleges? We have here the wizard's daughter. So Thomas Edison, his nickname was the Wizard. And his daughter from his second marriage, Madeline Edison, she attended Bryn Mawr in 1906. Her mother, Mina Edison, placed a high value on formal education. Mina chose the school not just for its robust education, but because she was sure Madeline would be exposed to the right people and find a suitable husband. Mina's plan, however, would not be seamless. As Madeline, she struggled with academia and would often have low grades. She would even have to retake her entrance exam. So this here is a report from M. Carey Thomas saying that Madeline failed some parts of her entry exam. She would have to retake it. Instead, her passion lay in theater. Madeline was attractive, outspoken, and popular. Her college scrapbook had countless invitations to social events and thank you notes. Besides acting, she played tennis and was a Glee Club member. Her best friends were Julia Thompson and Peggy James, niece of Henry James. And we have here some more documentation. I think it's interesting that it says on here that the person responsible for her fees is her mother. So Mina was the one paying for Madeline's education. You have a report card. You can see she has a lot of low grades here. And here's Madeline in a Shakespearean play. She's dressed up as the Princess of France. And you have her in another play here. This is a newspaper clipping. They say Miss Edison's intelligent conception of the difficult role of the music hall bride was the feature of an interesting presentation in the serious play. Her treatment in the third act situations, including particularly the climax, indicated the possession of an extraordinary degree of dramatic ability. So she really loved acting in theater here. And Madeline, she described herself as a grief bringer to her mother, a distracting parasite to her lover, an underachiever to herself. She was often very self-deprecating in her letters, very reminiscent of her mother. This could potentially be the symptom of living in a high-pressure environment like high society as a woman. And Madeline and her mother, they had a very difficult relationship. It would worsen when Madeline disappointed Mina in her decision to drop out of college. So she writes a letter home. She says, I don't have time at college to spend on my character, and that's why I insist on coming home to stay next year. I also realize your position and wanting me to stay here as the preliminary stages of developing a sweet disposition will probably be painful in the extreme, but perhaps with resolute application and profound research into ways and means, it may cure my chronic distemper. Madeline would ultimately only attend 2 years at Bryn Mawr College, leaving at the end of her sophomore year in 1908. And even though she left the college, she would still often be involved in events. She was very involved in the community at Bryn Mawr. Her father, Thomas Edison, he did not share the same viewpoint as his wife regarding Madeline's education, as he did not value formal education, especially for his daughter. He saw it as useless and a waste of money. In 1945, at the age of 57, Madeline would pen Reminiscence, reflecting over her life experiences. So we have this excerpt here. She says, after leaving college, did volunteer work in the Bureau of Municipal Research, New York City. Was offered a paid position here, which, however, my father did not allow me to accept. Early interests were along lines of dramatic work. In and after college, took leading parts in various amateur productions, coached plays for a girls' club, helped organize the Drama Guild of the Oranges. Like many women of her status during this era, Madeline's parents had control over her life trajectory. This can be observed in her father preventing her from accepting a paid position, and both her parents cutting her acting career short when a production involved a kiss scene. The family's image was more important than Madeline's personal feelings. She would, however, get her way when she married her college sweetheart, John Ayres Sloan, who her parents did not approve of. But that did not stop Madeline, and the couple would later have Edison's only grandchildren. So I think it's interesting. Most photos of Madeline, you do not see her smiling. You can see her smiling in her wedding photo here, and her parents do not look too happy in the background. And even though women like Madeline had privileged upbringings, they were bound by societal rules of etiquette and the specter of true womanhood. Now that we thoroughly analyze women's higher education during the late 19th to early 20th century, how does it compare to modern day? Colleges have expanded and diversified since the Victorian era and the 1920s, with many women's colleges either becoming co-ed or ceasing operations. Between 1998 and 2022, the status of about half of the nation's existing women's colleges changed, with 4 closing, 1 merging with another institution, and 28 becoming co-ed. 42.7% of enrolled undergraduate students are male, and 57.3% are female. 39% of enrolled students for grad schools are male, with 61% being female. So colleges are noticing a trend of more female attendance. How did this reversal happen? Several factors contribute to this trend, including increased motivation among females to pursue higher education, access to resources based on the family's background, and lower male completion rates in secondary education. And colleges are not only seeing more female attendance, but also more racial diversity. So you have 52.3% of college students identifying as white or Caucasian, 13.2% of students identifying as Black or African American, and as a percentage of total student enrollments, the rate of enrollments of students of color has increased from 15.36% in 1976 to 45.23% in 2022. And despite women making up more than half of college students worldwide, female academics still face barriers. So you can see here in this graph, 63.4% say that they have time-based conflicts between family and career. And females in academia frequently find themselves confined to specific roles, such as teaching and service, leaving little time for research. Typically, they hold fewer large grants and are less likely to have them renewed than men. Therefore, females are underrepresented in academic roles, have lower rates in research participation, and face barriers when seeking senior faculty and professorship positions. So women still face many of the same barriers today that they faced back then. So they still have to see do they want to prioritize their family or their career. Women in STEM, which is sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that has been highly encouraged in recent history. In 2017, Women in STEM, We STEM, was founded at the University of Chicago Lab School as a mechanism to bridge the gap between social justice and academic fields. Since then, We STEM has expanded to support over 20,000 high school students globally. And I am a woman in STEM, so this is my research poster during a research conference I went as an undergraduate. And why do women continue to pursue careers in STEM despite aforementioned structural barriers? A recent study's participants shared the following perspectives. Participant Hazel mentions that her decision to choose a career in science was motivated not only by the desire to acquire knowledge, but also by the purpose of understanding the world and contributing to the development of cities, organizations, and projects. Participant Edith alludes to the importance of understanding how the world works and seeks its transformation towards a better society, finding fulfillment and contributing with a positive impact on her environment. Participant Evelyn mentions that STEM careers historically did not align with traditional gender roles, but emphasize that women have the potential to perform in any profession that interests them and fits their abilities and talents. So a common theme that can be surmised from this presentation Women have always found purpose in engaging with and improving their communities. Before women were allowed to work in STEM, community involvement included volunteering. Historically, voluntarism has long provided the means for women to initiate good works and cultural improvements in their local communities. The focus mirrored the concerns of the larger society, and clubs ranged from religious, charitable, and social reform organizations to horticultural, literary, dramatic, and sporting groups. Sorry. So, for example, Thomas Edison's second wife, Mina, was active in community organizing in both their state of residence, so in New Jersey and West Orange, and their winter estate here in Fort Myers, Florida. So you can see Women's Club. And here is Mina. She's next to Clara Ford, Henry Ford's wife. So they're both very big in volunteering and philanthropy. And Madeline, she would take after her mother and volunteer with her local theaters and gardens, contribute to blood drives for the New Jersey Red Cross during World War II, and countless other efforts. And there has been recent concern of the decrease in male enrollment and retention in colleges. Reasons include affordability, working to support family, lack of interest, and not necessary for career advancement. Women share the same reasons as men for not completing their bachelor's degree and or not enrolling in college. So you can see the percentages are pretty similar for most of these here. And navigating the process of applying to and attending college is not an easy process, especially for first-generation students. Having a support system throughout the process is very important. It requires years of planning to successfully persevere. Mentorships and college integration programs being available for men and women can help with the enrollment and retention rate. And I think this quote here really stands out. College was beyond the reach of most men for lack of social status and of all women by virtue of their sex. In 1770, the bachelor's degree was the mark of distinction of potential leaders. Now it's very different. A lot of jobs do require you to have a bachelor's degree, so it doesn't have the same level of elitism it did back in 1770. And while colleges are more affordable compared to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, we have to recognize that finances are still a significant barrier for many potential college applicants. And for our conclusion here, how did women navigate restrictions to higher education in the late 19th to early 20th century? Women who could afford to attend private institutions like the Seven Sisters, that's what they would do. Public co-ed institutions, they provided a more affordable option, but women still often face sex-based discrimination. Access to higher education was highly dependent on familial support. And female college students, they would often lean on each other for support and create clubs and involve themselves in student government. So for a lot of them, this was the opportunity to make decisions on their own, be independent. How did Bryn Mawr and the other Seven Sisters colleges improve the condition of their alumni? What barriers did these women still face? An education received at the Seven Sisters that granted women opportunities in academia. For those not interested in an academic career, the environment introduced them to men of their caliber. So, for example, with Madeline, she wasn't really interested in being an academic, but she did meet her husband while she was in college, so it did serve that purpose for her. And Bryn Mawr and its sister schools, they were elitist environments that were not accepting of racial and ethnic minorities. Women who attended these institutions, they were pressured to succeed and integrate into society. And how did the achievements of the Seven Sisters influence modern-day higher education? The success of women who attended the Seven Sisters proved that women were capable of academic rigor. Graduates and supporters of these colleges would contribute to efforts to improve female education. And today, more women than men attend college, but still we deal with sexism. And there's still progress to be made in higher education, including the major issue of affordability. And here are some of my sources, my bibliography. And I thank you all for attending my presentation. This here is my college diploma. All right, hope you all enjoy your morning. Have a great day.